There's a backyard on an ordinary street that looks, from a passerby's angle, like nothing more than a nicely kept garden. A privacy fence, some fruit trees, a few raised beds. What you can't see from that angle is that every single thing growing or breeding back there was set up once, years ago, and has been paying out every month since without being replanted, restocked, or rebought. Last month, that backyard generated $5,000, not from a one-time harvest, from systems that were built to keep producing on their own, indefinitely, for as long as they're maintained. That distinction is the entire point of this video, so let's be precise about it before anything else. A lot of backyard income stories are really about an annual crop, or a batch of animals raised once and sold once, and then the whole cycle starts over from zero. What you're about to see is different. Every system in this backyard was deliberately chosen because it regenerates itself, either biologically or agriculturally, which means the upfront cost gets paid once, and the income keeps compounding for years afterward, not just for a single season. The woman behind that fence, we'll call her Laura, since she'd rather not use her full name, was a hospital billing coordinator for 11 years before a software conversion at her hospital system eliminated her entire department, replacing it with an automated claims platform and a much smaller remote team based at corporate headquarters. It wasn't a performance issue. It was a straightforward technology replacement, and she was one of 14 people let go in the same week. She had 8 weeks of severance, a mortgage she'd been paying alone since her divorce 3 years earlier, and a backyard that up until that point had one raised bed that mostly grew tomatoes she forgot to water. Here's the number that mattered most in the weeks that followed. Severance plus her modest savings gave her just under 4 months before she'd need to seriously consider selling the house. That deadline shaped every decision she made for the rest of that year. Being solely responsible for the mortgage added a layer of pressure that Laura is candid about when she talks through this period. There was no second income to fall back on, no partner's salary to buy her more runway while she figured out a next step. Every application she sent out, and every day that passed without a callback, carried a weight that a dual-income household simply wouldn't have felt in the same way. She applied for over 100 positions in the first month alone, most of them a meaningful step down from her previous role, and received exactly 3 responses, none of which turned into an offer. About 3 weeks into an increasingly discouraging job search, Laura came across a video about someone growing shiitake mushrooms on inoculated logs in a backyard, and what caught her attention wasn't the mushrooms themselves. It was a single sentence the person in the video said almost in passing. A properly inoculated log keeps fruiting for 3 to 5 years before it's spent. She'd been thinking up to that point entirely in terms of what she could grow and sell once. This was the first time she'd considered building something that would keep paying her without her having to start over every single season. So she ran the cheapest test she could think of. 4 oak logs, cut from a neighbor's tree that had come down in a storm, inoculated with shiitake spawn plugs she ordered online for about $35 total. She drilled the holes herself, hammered in the plugs, sealed them with wax, and stacked the logs in a shaded corner of the yard to wait, since shiitake logs take 6 to 12 months before their first flush of mushrooms even appears. That $35 test is where this actually starts, even though it would be nearly a year before it produced a single dollar. While she waited, Laura kept researching, and what she found changed the entire direction of what she eventually built. She started specifically looking for systems that shared that same set it up once, harvest for years quality, rather than systems that needed to be replanted or restocked from scratch every single cycle. I want to walk through the 4 systems she eventually built, in the order she built them, because the sequencing and the specific pays forever quality of each one is really the whole story here. System 1, the shiitake logs, came first and stayed small for a long time simply because of the weight. That waiting period deserves more attention than a single sentence, because it's genuinely the hardest part of building a system like this, harder in some ways than any of the actual physical labor involved. For nearly a year, Laura had 4 logs stacked in a shaded corner of the yard, doing, as far as she could tell from the outside, absolutely nothing. She checked them periodically, kept them appropriately shaded and occasionally soaked during dry stretches, and had no way to know for certain whether the inoculation had actually taken until the first mushrooms finally appeared. She describes that year as a genuine test of patience in a way none of the later systems, once she knew what to expect, ever quite matched. Once that first flush finally arrived, 10 months after inoculation, Laura had 40 pounds of fresh shiitakes off 4 logs, and she sold every pound within a week to 2 local restaurants at $12 a pound, just by walking in with a sample and asking if they had a reliable local supplier. Neither restaurant did. From there, she scaled to 32 logs over the following year, inoculating a new batch every spring so that logs at different points in their 3 to 5 year production life were always staggered, some just starting to fruit, some in peak production, some nearing the end of their run and due for replacement. That staggering is what turns a single harvest into a continuous monthly income stream instead of one big payout, followed by silence. Getting the staggering right took some trial and error of its own. Laura's first attempt at scaling involved inoculating all 28 new logs in a single spring session, which meant she'd eventually face the opposite problem a year or two down the road. A cliff where a large batch of logs all aged out of production around the same time, rather than a smooth, continuous rotation. She corrected course by spreading her annual inoculation across smaller batches through the growing season instead of one large batch, which took an extra year to fully even out, but has kept her monthly shiitake output far more consistent ever since. 32 logs in steady rotation now bring in $600 to $1,100 a month, and because a log fruits for years once established, her only ongoing cost is inoculating a modest number of replacement logs each spring as older ones age out, which runs a few $100s a year, not a few $100s every single harvest. System 2, a semi-dwarf fruit orchard, went in the following spring, funded by that first year of mushroom sales. Laura planted 11 semi-dwarf fruit trees, apple, pear, and plum varieties, chosen specifically for staggered ripening windows, so she wouldn't have 40 trees worth of fruit ripening in the same 2 weeks. Choosing those specific varieties took real research, rather than picking whatever the local nursery happened to stock. She worked out a ripening calendar on paper, before ever buying a single tree, mapping which varieties would come ready in which order, from early plums in midsummer through late-season apples that hang until nearly the first frost, specifically so that her fruit share subscribers would receive a rotating variety across the whole season, rather than a single glut of one fruit followed by nothing. Fruit trees are the clearest possible example of pays forever, not just once in this entire backyard. A semi-dwarf tree, once established, typically produces for 15 to 25 years, with no need to replant anything, ever, barring disease or storm damage. The first 2 years produced almost nothing, which Laura is upfront about, since young trees need to establish their root systems before serious fruiting begins. She remembers feeling in that second spring a specific kind of doubt that's different from the doubt of the mushroom log waiting year, because by then she'd already sunk real money into 11 trees that looked, to an untrained eye, exactly like ordinary yard trees, rather than an investment on the verge of paying off. By year 3, the orchard was producing enough that she started a small seasonal fruit share subscription. 22 households paying a flat seasonal fee for a weekly box during each fruit's peak window, plus wholesale surplus to a local grocery co-op. Building that subscription list followed the same pattern as every other channel in this backyard. It started with a handful of neighbors curious about the trees going in, grew through word of mouth once the fruit itself proved good enough to talk about, and now renews at a rate close to 90% each season, since a household that's had one good season of fresh, staggered fruit rarely wants to go back to buying whatever's on the grocery shelf. The orchard now brings in $800 to $1,000, $600 a month during active fruiting seasons, and considerably less in the deep winter months when nothing is in season at all, which is the one honest trade-off of a perennial system tied to natural fruiting windows rather than a controlled year-round operation. System 3, a breeding colony of meat rabbits, came next. Unlike an annual batch of animals raised once and sold once, a breeding colony of 8 does and 2 bucks is genuinely self-perpetuating, does produce a new litter every 6 to 8 weeks, and as long as Laura maintains breeding stock rather than selling every single rabbit, the colony replaces and grows itself indefinitely without ever needing to buy new breeding animals again. Setting up the colony correctly from the start mattered more than she initially appreciated. Her original 2 bucks came from 2 entirely separate sources, chosen deliberately to avoid the genetic problems that can arise from a closely related founding population, a detail she'd read about but only partly understood the importance of until a local rabbit breeder walked her through it in more depth. She sells meat rabbits to 2 families who buy directly for home processing, to a specialty butcher who supplies 2 upscale restaurants, and breeding stock itself to other people starting their own small colonies, which is actually her highest margin channel, since a proven breeding pair sells for considerably more than the same 2 rabbits would bring in as meat. That breeding stock channel took time to develop, growing mostly through a regional homesteading and small livestock group where Laura began answering questions from other beginners, which naturally led to some of those same people eventually buying their own starter pair from her once they'd decided to move forward. This system brings in $700 to $1,300 a month on a colony that, once established, requires no ongoing purchase of new stock at all. System 4, a laying flock of quail, rounded out the backyard. Quail reach egg-laying maturity in about 8 weeks and lay nearly year-round under the right lighting conditions, and like the rabbits, a breeding flock replenishes itself continuously rather than needing to be restocked. Laura chose quail specifically after considering standard chickens first, and settled on quail largely because of the smaller footprint and quieter presence, both of which mattered given how close her co-op needed to sit to the property line, separating her from a neighbor she wanted to stay on good terms with. Quail eggs also carry a novelty and culinary appeal that standard chicken eggs don't, which opened a specific niche market she hadn't initially anticipated when she started researching the option. Laura sells quail eggs to 2 households on a standing weekly subscription, wholesale to a specialty grocery store that stocks them for a niche culinary customer base, and periodically sells surplus breeding stock to other backyard keepers the same way she does with the rabbits. This system brings in $400 to $800 a month from a coop smaller than a garden shed. Add all 4 systems together in a genuinely strong month, when the orchard is at peak fruiting and every channel across all 4 systems is running at its top range, and you get the $5,000 in this video's title. In a typical month, particularly during the winter stretch when the orchard is dormant, the honest floor runs closer to $2,600. I want to be direct about that gap, the same way I try to be in every one of these breakdowns, because a video that only shows the best month isn't actually being honest with you. Total combined startup cost across all 4 systems, spread out the way Laura actually built them over roughly 3 years rather than all at once. A little under $3,000 total, including the shiitake log inoculation supplies, the 11 fruit trees and their planting materials, the rabbit hutches and breeding stock, and the quail coop and initial flock. Because each system was funded by the one before it, the household budget itself was never seriously strained at any single point, even though the total investment across 3 years adds up to a meaningful sum. Here's the actual daily and weekly rhythm across all 4 systems, because self-perpetuating doesn't mean no maintenance, and I don't want to imply that it does. The rabbits and quail need daily feeding and water checks, about 20 minutes combined each morning. The mushroom logs need almost nothing day-to-day beyond periodic soaking during dry stretches to trigger fruiting cycles, maybe 15 minutes a few times a week depending on the season. The orchard needs seasonal pruning, a few weekends a year, plus regular harvesting during each fruit's active window, which is genuinely the busiest stretch of Laura's year. Averaged across the full calendar, total hands-on time runs about 11 to 13 hours a week, with real seasonal variation, closer to 20 hours a week during peak summer fruit harvest, and closer to 6 or 7 hours a week in the depths of winter when only the rabbits and quail need regular attention. That seasonal swing is worth sitting with for a moment, because it's genuinely different from a more consistent, evenly distributed operation you might expect. Laura's summer weeks, particularly during the 6-week stretch when the plum and early apple varieties overlap, look considerably busier than her winter weeks, and she's had to learn to plan around that rather than expecting a flat, predictable schedule every week of the year. Some of the smaller decisions in how she built this, staggering the orchard's ripening windows, for instance, were made specifically to soften that swing rather than eliminate it entirely, since a harvest window that's too compressed would demand more hours in those 6 weeks than she could realistically sustain on her own alongside the daily rabbit and quail care. Now, the part that came close to undoing a meaningful chunk of this. In year 2, about 4 months after the rabbit colony was established, a respiratory illness swept through the colony, something Laura hadn't encountered before and initially didn't recognize the early signs of. The first symptom she noticed was subtle, just one doe seeming slightly less energetic at feeding time than usual, easy enough to dismiss as nothing in particular. It wasn't until 2 days later, when she noticed mild nasal discharge, that she recognized something was genuinely wrong, and by then the illness had already had time to move through the shared airspace of the hutches. By the time she realized something was seriously wrong, 3 of her 8 does were showing symptoms, and rabbit respiratory illness spreads fast in close housing. Within a week, she'd lost 2 does entirely, and had to isolate and treat the third. Losing 2 of 8 breeding does isn't just a temporary revenue dip. In a system built specifically around the idea that breeding stock never needs to be repurchased, losing a quarter of that breeding stock struck at the exact premise the whole system was built on. Laura told me this was the point she genuinely questioned whether she'd been naive about how self-sustaining these systems actually were in practice, whether the entire pitch of Pays Forever was more fragile than she'd let herself believe. What actually got her through it wasn't a dramatic fix. She isolated the sick doe immediately, thoroughly disinfected every hutch and piece of equipment the colony used, and, This is the part she says made the real difference going forward. She established a strict quarantine protocol for any new breeding stock brought in from outside, something she hadn't been doing before, since her original 2 bucks had come from 2 different sources without any isolation period at all. She rebuilt the colony back to full breeding capacity over the following 4 months using stock from her own surviving does rather than buying replacements, which is itself a demonstration of the exact self-perpetuating quality the whole system depends on. Even after losing a quarter of the colony, she never had to purchase new foundational breeding stock again. That rebuild took patience, and she admits more than a little anxiety every time a doe showed even the slightest hint of the same early symptoms she'd initially missed the first time, a vigilance that eventually relaxed as month after month passed without any recurrence. That respiratory scare is the reason Laura now treats any new animal entering either the rabbit or quail systems with a mandatory 2-week isolation period before it ever joins the main colony, no exceptions, regardless of how healthy it looks on arrival. It's the one piece of infrastructure she wishes she'd built in from day one rather than learning she needed the hard way. Let's talk about the actual trade-off in time, because I think it matters more than either the $2,600 or the $5,000 headline number. At her old hospital billing job, Laura worked a standard 40-hour week, but with mandatory overtime during quarterly audit periods, 4 times a year, that regularly pushed her past 50 hours for 2 to 3 week stretches. Her salary before the layoff was $59,000 a year. Break that down against her real average annual hours, including those audit crunches, and it comes out to a little under $27 an hour. The backyard, at an average month of roughly $2,600 in profit against a yearly average of around 12 hours a week, works out to about $50 an hour. The same caveats apply here that apply to every comparison like this. No benefits, no guaranteed floor, and real biological risk, as the rabbit illness demonstrated directly. It also doesn't include the 3 years of unpaid groundwork building the orchard to full production and the breeding colonies to stable size. But even with every caveat included, Laura hasn't had a single quarterly audit week panic in 3 years, and her income now grows every year as the orchard matures further rather than being capped by whatever a salary review decides. There's one more set of questions worth addressing before the practical lessons, and it's the one I'd rather answer directly rather than leave people guessing. What did Laura's kids make of all this? And where did the startup money actually come from across 3 years of building? On the kids question, Laura has 2 children, ages 9 and 13, and both have ended up more involved in the day-to-day than she initially expected when she started. Her younger child in particular has taken a real interest in the rabbits specifically, helping with feeding most mornings before school, which Laura says has become one of the more unexpectedly meaningful parts of the whole project rather than just an income source. The mushroom logs and orchard get less hands-on interest from either child, mostly because there's simply less daily interaction required with either system compared to feeding live animals every morning. On Startup Capital, the honest answer is that nothing about this was funded by a single large investment. The initial $35 mushroom test came from money she'd have spent on groceries that week regardless. The 11 fruit trees, roughly $600 total, came from the first year of mushroom sales, plus a modest amount of remaining severance. The rabbit hutches and breeding stock, close to $400, came from a combination of mushroom and early orchard income. And the quail coop and flock, the smallest investment of the 4 at under $200, came entirely from rabbit sales by that point. She's candid that this sequencing wasn't just a financial strategy. It was, in the early going, the only option available to her, since there simply wasn't a large lump sum to spend on all 4 systems at once, even if she'd wanted to. If someone has more capital available up front than she did, the sequence could move faster. But she'd still recommend proving each system works in your own specific space and climate before scaling it, rather than skipping straight to a large investment based on someone else's numbers. I asked Laura directly whether she'd ever considered adding a 5th system, since the 4 she's built clearly work, and there's some unused space left along the back fence line. She has thought about it and held off for reasons that reflect the same principle the whole backyard was built around. Any new system would need to meet the same bar the first 4 did, genuinely self-perpetuating, not something requiring a repeated seasonal purchase. She looked seriously at adding a small perennial asparagus bed, since a well-established asparagus planting can produce for 15 to 20 years, but concluded that the relatively modest income ceiling of a bed that size, likely $200 to $300 a month at best, didn't justify the 2 to 3 years asparagus needs before its first real harvest, especially compared to expanding her existing, already proven systems instead. There's also the labor question, which she weighs carefully now after 3 years of learning her own actual capacity. Adding a 5th system wouldn't just add its own maintenance time. It would compete for the same peak summer hours that the orchard harvest already demands most heavily, and Laura has learned that stretching herself too thin during that specific 6-week window is what actually causes mistakes, not a lack of overall weekly hours. For now, she's chosen to hold at 4 systems and instead focus on deepening what she already has, expanding the orchard by 4 more trees this past spring, chosen specifically to fill a gap in her ripening calendar between the plum and late apple harvests, rather than adding an entirely new category of system to manage. There are a few questions people ask constantly once they hear a setup like this, and I'd rather answer them directly. The first is about the actual meaning of pays forever, since nothing biological genuinely lasts forever without any maintenance at all. Laura's honest answer is that the phrase means something specific and real, not literal. These systems don't require the recurring capital expense of replanting an annual crop or repurchasing breeding stock every cycle, the way a one-time batch of meat chickens or a single season of vegetables would. They do require ongoing care, ongoing feed, and eventual replacement of individual trees or logs as they age out over 15 to 25 years or 3 to 5 years respectively. Forever means the foundational investment doesn't reset to zero every season, not that the system runs itself with no attention at all. The second common question is about space, since 4 separate systems sounds like it should require more land than a typical backyard offers. Laura's full setup occupies a yard just under a quarter acre, which is larger than a small urban lot, but nowhere near a small farm. And she's candid that someone with less space would need to scale down proportionally, likely choosing 2 or 3 systems rather than all 4, prioritizing whichever ones fit their actual available square footage and local climate best. A closely related question, and one Laura gets almost as often, is whether this specific climate she lives in was a necessary ingredient, given that fruit trees and shiitake logs both depend on real seasonal variation to thrive. Her honest answer is that the specific varieties and species would need to change in a meaningfully different climate, but the underlying principle wouldn't. A warmer, more consistent climate might favor different fruit varieties with lower chill hour requirements, or different mushroom species better suited to the local temperature range, or animal breeds selected for heat tolerance rather than cold hardiness. The 4 systems she landed on were chosen partly because they fit her specific region well, not because they're the only combination capable of meeting the pays forever bar anywhere in the country. The third question, and probably the most common one, is whether this specific combination of mushrooms, fruit trees, rabbits, and quail is the only way to build something like this, for someone with no interest in any of those 4 specifically. Laura's answer, and mine, is that the specific systems are almost beside the point. What actually made this work was the underlying selection principle, choosing systems that regenerate themselves biologically or agriculturally, rather than systems that reset to zero every single cycle, and then sequencing the build so each system funds the next, rather than borrowing to build everything at once. In a different climate, with different local demand, the specific 4 systems might look completely different. The principle, pays forever, not just once, is what's actually repeatable, not this particular list. None of that makes for a particularly thrilling story to tell out loud. It's not a hidden trick or a secret loophole. It's a $35 mushroom log test that took nearly a year to pay off. 3 years of sequential building, a respiratory illness that nearly undermined the entire premise the setup was built on, and a strict quarantine protocol that now protects the system nobody driving past that privacy fence would ever guess is generating real income at all. So, a backyard just under a quarter acre built over 3 years, 1 system funding the next. No employees, not one. 11 to 13 hours a week on average with real seasonal swings. A combined startup cost spread across 3 years of under $3,000, and an honestly reported floor of roughly $2,600 a month, with a real ceiling of $5,000 in a genuinely strong fruiting season. Stepping back from the individual numbers for a moment, what strikes me most about Laura's version of this is how little any single system actually resembles the others. A mushroom log, a fruit tree, a breeding rabbit, and a laying quail have almost nothing in common biologically, and yet she selected all 4 using the exact same single filter. Does this regenerate itself, or does it reset to zero every cycle? That discipline, applied consistently across 4 completely different categories of living thing, is really what this whole backyard demonstrates, more than any specific species or technique. It's a reminder that the pays forever principle isn't really about mushrooms or rabbits at all. It's a lens you can apply to almost any income idea, biological or otherwise, simply by asking whether the upfront investment gets paid once and keeps compounding, or whether it quietly resets every single season without you fully noticing. That's the full story behind that fence. not a secret, not a trick. A mushroom log test that took almost a year to produce anything, a rabbit colony that nearly collapsed to illness in year 2, and 4 systems that were deliberately chosen from the very beginning because none of them require starting over from zero. I asked Laura, near the end of our conversation, whether she had any regrets about how it all unfolded, whether, knowing what she knows now, she'd have built the orchard sooner, skipped the slow year waiting on the first mushroom logs, or handled the rabbit illness differently in the moment. She thought about it for a while before answering. The slow year waiting on the mushroom logs, she said. She wouldn't rush even if she could, because that forced patience early on is exactly what prepared her for the 2 to 3 years the fruit trees needed before serious production. A timeline that would have felt unbearable if the mushrooms hadn't already taught her what waiting on a perennial system actually feels like. The rabbit illness, though, she genuinely wishes had never happened, not primarily for the tutas she lost, but because it forced her to confront, in a very concrete way, that self-sustaining was never the same thing as risk-free, a distinction she'd been glossing over in her own head until that week. If there's one piece of advice she'd want someone in her position to actually hear, it's that any system built around not needing to be restocked still needs real protection against the specific things that could force a restock anyway. Built in before the crisis, not after. That's not the kind of lesson that fits neatly on a thumbnail next to a dollar figure. But it's the actual thing that determined whether this story ended with a devastated rabbit colony in year 2 or continued for 2 more years afterward, and I think it matters more than almost anything else in this video. To give a sense of how gradual this growth actually was, rather than a straight climb to $5,000, it's worth walking through the trajectory in broad strokes. Year 1 produced almost nothing beyond that first 40-pound shiitake flush and its modest follow-on sales, since the orchard hadn't been planted yet and neither the rabbits nor the quail existed as systems at all. Year 2 added the orchard, still 2 years from serious production, plus the rabbit colony, which is when the respiratory illness hit and temporarily set back the one system that was supposed to be furthest along towards stability. Year 3 is when everything finally started operating at something close to its current combined output, with the orchard finally fruiting in real volume, the rabbit colony fully rebuilt, and then some, and the quail flock, the last piece added, reaching its own steady production. That 3-year runway before the numbers in this video's title became a realistic monthly average is worth being upfront about, since it's a meaningfully longer timeline than a lot of backyard income stories imply, and it's a direct consequence of choosing systems that pay forever specifically, because they take real time to establish in the first place. If you'd want to see the actual layout, how the mushroom logs are staggered by production year, how the fruit varieties were chosen for ripening windows, and exactly how the rabbit quarantine setup works now. That's a video I'm considering putting together separately, and whether I make it depends on whether there's real interest in that level of detail rather than just the overview you just watched. So say so in the comments, specifically, not just more please, but which of the 4 systems you'd want the closest look at. That tells me far more than a like ever could, and I do read every comment on videos like this one. If this is the kind of setup you want more of, built to compound rather than reset every season, real numbers included, not just the highlight reel, subscribing is genuinely the best way to make sure the next one actually reaches you, since none of us can count on any platform's algorithm to do that reliably anymore. Thanks so much for staying with this one all the way through, from that $35 mushroom log test at the very start to the 4th and final system closing out this backyard right here. 4 systems, 1/4 acre yard, and an income that keeps compounding year over year instead of resetting to 0 every single season.